Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this month's webinar by TopStep. My name is Ron Bro. I'll be presenting for you today. Happy to talk about the exciting topic around revenue forecasting in OpenAir. Okay, so what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at kind of an overview of what are the elements involved in forecasting for OpenAir. How are the different setup options, the different ways you can use the system to look. Think of forecasting as, what sort of crystal ball and how good is my crystal ball inside of OpenAir. Because really what you're trying to derive here is you're trying to look into the future and you're trying to make, these decisions and information about what's going to happen in the future. And so really forecasting gives you that visibility. Now, what I'll tell customers all the time is if you can do forecasting in OpenAir and you can do it, within a reasonable accuracy, then it means you are using all of OpenAir well, because it is not just one section of the product or another section of the product. It really is all sections of the product that have to work together in unison in order to get an accurate forecast. So we're going to talk through what are the pieces of the product that are involved and some of the options you have. So, prerequisite for any forecasting reporting in OpenAir is obviously you have to have users. Users could have costs if you're looking to look at future, forecast project margin. Users can have default bill rates, or you can use rate cards or job codes. And so basically, and as well as, potentially have services as well in your system set up. Obviously, the hub of forecasting is at a project level, and the project level should have billing rules at a minimum based on how you intend to bill your customer, whether those be time-based billing rules or fixed fee billing rules. And then alternatively, you may also be using OpenAir for revenue recognition. So you'll have created the RevRec rules appropriate to the type of revenue recognition methodology you're doing. So those are sort of the prerequisites. If you don't have those, there's some ways to do forecasting, but they're very inaccurate and generic. Once you do have the setup in place, then it just determines, okay, what are we looking at? What is our future, right? If we're saying that it's a crystal ball into the future, what is the basis to which we want to judge the future? And obviously there are several options. You could have bookings. You may call it differently, bookings allocations, but basically this is your resources being able to be scheduled into future periods and a level of accuracy there. You might use your project task structure and task assignments and use that to forecast into the future instead of bookings. You may have dates on your project that you want to use for forecasting, and we'll talk about what that looks like. And then lastly, we see customers with milestones, and you may manage the milestones, when you expect these milestones to meet or to happen, and that also can create a future view of your billing or revenue recognition. For executing your forecast, it's basically going to be based on how you set OpenAir up, and we're going to talk through some of the different options. You can have budgets for generating your forecast. We can have run our billing forecasts, RevRec forecasts. And obviously, all of this is based on reports. So and we'll talk through some of the forecasting values in OpenAir that support the reporting. But this is kind of what I said earlier. If you're doing forecasting well, you're using all the standard set of data points, all the features in OpenAir, and you're using them well. So kudos to you for that. There are two basically methods we see customers using, and they're not mutually exclusive methods. You can determine when to use one version but the other. But the most common is charge-based projections. So charge-based projections are going to give you a bottom-up calculation. And we're going to talk about the different setup, but it's basically going to combine your billing or rev rec setup with your future value dates or schedules or whatever, depending on if it's T&M or fixed fee, and it's going to automatically generate projections for you. So it requires all the elements we saw in the previous slide, and then it allows you to build a report to show what the future might look like. The other option we see is straight line forecasting. And this one is a straightforward, pardon the pun, but basically it requires on a project that you basically have a start and end date and a budget. And then you just peanut butter spread that over time. And we'll talk about a little bit of some of the details around that. But where we see these two working together is where you may have different project stages, and maybe you're tracking projects early in a pipeline stage, and for those projects you don't have billing rules yet, you don't have all your future looking data in yet, but you still want to get some level of forecasting out of the system for those. And that's where we see straight line forecasting kind of fit in to be able to, and we can apply probabilities. You could have a custom fields and do custom calculations where you can take the probability of that pipeline, maybe 50% probable times the straight line forecasting, and then be able to generate a weighted forecast for straight line. Straight line is set at a project stage level. So we'll show you what that looks like using custom fields in the next few slides. There is another option using project budgets. You can, if you just want to say, I don't want to use, I know what my dollars are, I want to be able to put those in the system and use those. Project budgets is another option, which we'll talk about. So what are some of the details around charge projections? It's charge-based forecasting, really drives, it's set up in the project settings, and it can be scheduled to run nightly. There is also an option to be able to have it run on demand within a specific project using the light bulb and clicking the Run Charge Projections Now option. As it's running either globally or on demand, you can check the status. And the on demand is very quick. Generally, it happens immediately versus depending on how many projects you're calculating. Usually, we tell customers to have it run in the middle of the night because could take a bit of time to run across all projects. So, what is it doing? So, it's up to you how we want to look at future data. And so obviously, if you're using the bookings module and you have resource managers and project managers working together to determine, who's going to be on which projects for what dates and what amount of hours. And if you do a lot of T&M, time-based billing, then booked hours is probably the most common setting that we see here. And this is basically going to take the booked hours. It's going to look at the rates and the billing rules by either job code or by user or other values, and it's going to generate a forecasted dollars and forecasted hours calculations that you can then report on. So booked hours is purely looking at the schedule. Assigned hours, this is if you were using a project plan to drive the future. So you're managing your start and finish dates inside your project plan, you're managing the assigned hours down at the user level. And this can also be the basis for looking forward. There are some challenges with using assigned hours. Obviously, it's going to drive how your task structures needs to be set up because the start and finish dates are at the task level, not at the user level. So you get more of a task-driven start and end date versus a user-based start and end date, which you would get with booking. So it does give you, there's a few challenges, but if you are managing your projects and this gives you what you need, then we do have some customers that are using assigned hours. Why in the world would you use approved or worked hours, right? Those are past, those are behind us, not in the future. We don't see this for generating forecasts, but it is an option. And we've seen customers use this for other reason, not for forecasting reason. One example is I've got a customer that wants to say, as soon as hours are entered on a timesheet, I want to be able to report on the dollar value of those hours. Well, how do we get that value? Because the time could be sitting in open, and there's no monetary application yet because it hasn't been approved to run through a billing role. Well, we can use forecasting in OpenAir and charge projections to take those hours and times the rates on the billing and monetize those hours, even though they might be in the past. So worked hours, approved hours, there's some legitimate use cases there. It's not the most common use case, but they are available. The more common ones we see are approved and booked, or approved and assigned, worked. And so why would I want to compare the past with the future? Well, it's easy. A lot of customers will want to say, how are we doing for the month of August, right? We're in the middle of the month. I want to run a forecast for August as well as future months. Well, I have actuals in the first week or two of August, and I've got projected in the next 2 weeks of August, and I want to be able to combine those into a single dollar figure. And so depending on if I want approved or worked, depending on how much timesheets change from the point they go from work to approved, you can determine what's the best one for you. If you choose approved, it means as people are putting time on their timesheet throughout the week, it's still using booked hours until that timesheet is approved. Then it's going to use approved hours in the past, and then booked hours where there's up to the point the last booked hour, last approved hour exists. Worked gives you a little more flexibility because as people are putting time on their timesheet, it automatically replaces the booked hours. So if I was scheduled to work 40 hours last week, assuming 8 hours a day, on day one, I enter 4 hours on my timesheet instead of the 8 that the bookings represented. I will get a 4-hour projection for Monday and then 32 hours for the remainder of the week. And so in that case, I get a 36-hour projection, which may be accurate. It may not be. So again, that goes back to you have to decide as business by business, company by company, what makes the most sense. But those are some of the use cases that we see as we're talking with customers around how they want to set up their projections. The projection table by default is generally focused on creating charge projections, which indicates billing projections. There is a checkbox on the settings that allow you to create recognition projections. So this would be this is using the revenue recognition rules in your per project. And then once you run that nightly projection, it'll not only generate your charge-based billing projections, but also your revenue projections. And then you'll have those values to be able to add to your reports for both of those. Pivot date is also a critical thing to think about as you're setting up your charge projections. Is what is my date that I want to create projections for? We've had customers that will, date it a year in the past and 4 years in the future, and they'll hard code those dates, and they'll just run projections nightly, refresh any changes, and then they run reports and they get some actuals in the past and forecast in the future. That's an option. The problem with that option is at some point the date range is going to need to be updated. If you're looking to run some sort of a recurring time period forecasting, you have to manage those dates. So that's the downside of hard coding the dates on your forecast. The other option that we see more common is a relative range. And what this relative range allows you to do is basically put in metadata values for your starting points. So in this example here, we have last month, and then we're going last month plus 3,650 days, which would be 10 years. So you can come in here, you can say last week, you could say this week moving forward, next week moving forward. So as the weeks come and go, the projections are basically taking the metadata value for the date and generating the projections as you go through. So it allows you to not have to maintain the dates and be able to benefit from them. So that's pretty common setup, be able to come in with that meta relative date range to help you manage your pivot dates. If you are looking at the period before the date, you're getting actuals or both charges and or revenue transactions. The reporting values there would be project billing and recognized revenue. So as you're looking at your reporting in OpenAir, that would be the values you'd report on. Those would give you the values up to the point of your relative date or your pivot date. The period after the pivot date is going to be your projected values. So in this projected billing and or projected revenue, those will give you the projection-based data that the system is calculating for you. Revenue rules. So revenue rules can be tricky in trying to predict how they're going to generate future dated information. So some of these pretty straightforward, but for percent complete, for both the standard percent complete as well as incurred versus forecast percent complete, it's basically going to look at the bookings or project assigned hours, and it's going to calculate what the percent complete of the project's going to be based on those future periods, and it will then, taking that percent, it will calculate a forecasted amount of dollars based on that. So it's replicating a percent complete calc based on those future values and your denominators of your planned hours or your budget hours, and calculating a future value there. Your as-billed rule is basically going to replicate what the billing rules are. So if you're doing time billing, then your revenue rules will just mimic your time billing transaction project projections. Fixed amount of milestones, pretty straightforward. It's going to generate a fixed fee amount based on either the date on the billing rule or the date on the milestone. And then fixed fee on percent complete, it's going to calculate based on, similar to the other percent complete, it's going to calculate what percent complete is going to hit a certain period, and it'll generate that fixed fee amount in that future period when it expects the percent to meet that criteria. Expenses and purchases, you do not have forecasting capabilities. So we're going to talk about maybe how can you use a project budget feature for those, but there's no projections because there's nothing in the future that represents when an expense is going to be incurred or when a purchase is going to be incurred. So that's why you don't have the ability. Now, I have had customers use generic resources and use those to mimic when expenses are going to be incurred. And then you would use a time billing rule to monetize that if you needed to be able to forecast on either expenses or purchases. That's one way to get around this, but we'll talk about another option as well. And then there's a revenue rule called a time billing rule. This is basically going to mimic the time billing rule on the project. The time billing rev rule will mimic the time billing rule. We mentioned straight line projections. One thing to notice about straight line projections is it requires a start date and an end date. And so in this example, we've got January through April. It's going to look at the budget, and it's going to calculate how many days in each month there are, and it's going to divide that into the budget to come up with a daily amount. So it's not actually completely spreading evenly across the months. It's going to basically, it could be some variations based on the number of work days in the month. So in the example here, January and February both had 20 days. So the straight line projection was the 23.8. However, March and April had more working days, so the straight line increased for those months. So that's how straight line projections behave. They are not just a pure peanut butter spread, but they're actually looking at the days available, which makes sense. If you're interested in straight line projections, there's a couple of setup pieces you need. You need a custom field on a project stage, because as I mentioned, it is a stage filter, stage settings. And so you create a checkbox field, and it has to be called exactly the straight line billing projections. Once you enable that, you also need an end date, and it needs to be an exact end date field, custom date field under the project _end_date. And so those are two fields needed to support straight line projections. And then you have to go into the stage where you want the straight line projection to behave. And so, again, most times we see it in some sort of a pre-win scenario, pipeline, or proposal stage, and check the box on the stage. And so when projections run, all the projects in that stage will accommodate the straight line rules, and all the other projects will accommodate how you set your charge projections up as the charge projection table is created each night. I mentioned project budgets. Project budget, there's 3 different ways you can track budgets in OpenAir. There's just the standard budget field that you can populate on a project properties. There's what are called transactional budgets. So this is where under the financials, you can set multiple budgets if you want to track costs, change orders, or as budgets change, or even having budgets by the different elements of the project. The project budget feature came out a few years ago, and it allows you to basically go in and hand enter future dated budgets, and then be able to compare those future dated budgets to actuals coming in. So in this example here, you can do that at a project level. You can do it down to a task level as well. This is an example where we set this project budget up at a project level and say we want to be able to forecast what expenses we're going to have. So we're forecasting $1,500 a month of expenses. And we can report on that $1,500 a month as we look at our forecast reports. Those values become available to us. And then you can start to compare, okay, what do we actually accommodate or spend in each month for expenses and or for purchases. So this is another workaround option for being able to, you can do the same for labor, but it's generally looking at cost-based forecasting versus top-line billing. So it's going to look at the cost of the resources over what you're expecting the cost to be. And you can use bookings to generate where your costs expected to be. So it's really cost-based budgeting versus billing-based budgeting. So we see mostly when this is used is if there's a desire to do non-labor forecasting and cost analysis, where this can be helpful. So again, this gives you kind of another view here. Most expenses and purchases are passed through both billing and revenue recognition. So projects can hold the updates. You can do markups and have those visible here. And you can have those planned costs spread over a period. So in this example, we set our lodging. We're going to do weekly amount of lodging, $450, starting with a start date and end date. And then that'll automatically spread those dollars across the project. And you can then report against that. And also, you can see that budget versus actuals in this table within the project itself. Now, the good news is there is, in this example, there is inline editing. So if you want to change a value here, update a value, a different value, you're not opening a record. You are just double clicking into the fields and being able to override. So that's inline editing is handy here for being able to quickly make a change to your future budget as needed. Maybe project, maybe 1 month, the project goes on hold. So you want to remove the expenses for that period so you can quickly just zero those out here and be able to show that in your reporting. So speaking of reporting, we mentioned a lot of these, but some of the most common projection-based reporting values, projected revenue, projected cost. If you're looking to do projected margin, right? Based on my bookings, based on my revenue, based on my billings, what is my projected cost? And ultimately, you can have projected margin in reporting by project, and that can be really powerful to be able to say how are we doing on our project. If you're using that budget feature we mentioned, you have project budget expenses or cost and project budget purchases cost. You can bring into summary and detail reports to show those future values. You can, even though we have pivot dates in the charge projections, you can also update there's a way to be able to, in reports, to be able to set dates that you can use as filters. So you can go against what the charge projection dates are doing by setting a further date for. You can also use, you're always going to be looking at transaction dates. You cannot do accounting dates in the future because the system doesn't understand what a future value accounting date looks like. So if you say, what date do I want to use for revenue transactions when I'm doing a forecast, it's going to use the date that it calculates the projection. It doesn't understand the value. So if you set it for accounting date or you set it for transaction date, they're one and the same when it comes to projections. Is part of the setup and reporting. And we create a lot of custom calcs with customers to be able to say, okay, I want to see how am I doing this year, right? So if I want to say how are we doing in 2022, well, I've got actuals up through July. I've got forecasts for August through December. And so there you can create custom calcs to be able to give you kind of an estimate for the year or estimate a project from the beginning of the project through the end of the project. Custom calcs can give you that powerful reporting to be able to see the past, the future combined into a single view. So that's pretty common use case for creating these custom calculations. Forecasting is only as good as the data. So I mentioned earlier, if you're doing good forecasting and you're getting relatively good information, it means you've got good data and good usage of OpenAir, and that's really a prerequisite for being able to get good reporting. So in summary today, leveraging actual invoicing and revenue features of OpenAir with resource management gives you that forecasting capabilities. Think about pipeline forecasting if you're looking at straight line. Again, you may not have all the bookings, all the future view data in, but you may know enough to be able to say, what's my start and end date, what's my expected budget, and maybe potentially even add a probability to close there. And then you can combine all that into a single forecast report by, subtotaling by project stage. So that can be really helpful. If you do have pieces of your business that you're struggling to forecast because they don't match, resourcing or milestone-based, project budgets may be a trick there to help you be able to forecast those non-resource and non-milestone-based pieces of your project. And obviously reporting, it's going to be a combination of standard values using the projected table, as well as custom calculations that you create as needed. So that's the end of today's presentation. Appreciate everyone's attendance today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.